Definitely the question that I'm asked the most often is how I make the frosting for my cakes. And the answer is my 4-minute buttercream, and I have a recipe for it on my website and a very detailed tutorial. But I thought it would be useful to put together a video answering all of those questions, which hopefully you'll find helpful. I suppose you could make buttercream without a mixer. You'd have to have a lot of arm strength and also a lot of patience. If you have a handheld mixer, you could use that instead of a stand mixer. It's just a bit more of a labour-intensive process. Even though it's only supposed to take 4 minutes to do the mixing, holding the mixer with your hand and moving it through the thick butter and sugar for that length of time is actually really exhausting. So possible with a handheld mixer, wouldn't recommend it, and maybe possible without a mixer at all. Yes, absolutely. I use salted and unsalted butter interchangeably, but if you do it with salted butter, just don't add the salt that's in the recipe. Yes, you can from a consistency point of view. It will taste different. The taste that butter gives the buttercream is really unique, and the flavour of margarine and shortening is a little bit different. So if you've ever tasted buttercream made with actual butter, I'm sure you will be able to taste the difference when it's made with something else. Every butter seems to have a different colour. I don't have a particular brand that I use. I'm living in North America at the moment, and the butter that I buy in the supermarket is quite a light colour compared to butters that I've used in England, and I'm sure it varies from country to country and brand to brand. If you mix the butter on its own in the mixing bowl for a few minutes before you start the process of making the buttercream, it should lighten the butter a little bit, and then you'll end up with more of a white colour. Definitely use powdered sugar, not normal baking sugar, caster sugar, granulated sugar, white sugar. It does need to be powdered sugar. And it should say somewhere on the packaging that it's 10x powdered sugar, which just means that it's been sifted 10 times. So it's a really, really fine powdered sugar. And if you use one that isn't as fine, you'll notice a difference in the texture of your buttercream. A lot of people ask if you can just reduce the amount of sugar in the recipe to make the buttercream less sweet. And although that's possible to a certain extent, and I'll explain it in a second, unfortunately this type of buttercream is just a very sweet buttercream. So if you don't like sweet buttercreams, I would recommend trying something else. You could try a meringue-based buttercream or a ganache, but this buttercream does rely on the sugar. The reason is for stability. It's what keeps buttercream firm, and that gives it its shape when you're frosting or when you're piping. So you could reduce the amount of sugar a little bit, and then with it also reduce the amount of milk or cream. And that way it will still have a similar consistency, but if you take too much of it away, it'll become very liquid and it will just slide off your cake and your piping won't hold its form. No, a whisk attachment won't work for this buttercream. It does have to be a paddle attachment or a beater. And the reason is because you don't want to incorporate a lot of air into the buttercream, because then it will get air bubbles, and the paddle attachment mixes it really well without doing that. A whisk, the entire purpose of it is to incorporate air, so don't use one of those. It isn't necessary for this recipe. If you want to beat it for longer, there shouldn't be a problem with it as long as you keep the mixer on its lowest setting and as long as you're using a paddle attachment and not a whisk attachment. But it's not necessary. If you beat it for just a minute after each addition of the sugar, that will be enough time to incorporate the sugar and the butter together, and then once you add the liquid at the end, it will be the perfect consistency. You really don't need to beat it for longer. If after you've mixed your buttercream, you notice little white lumps in the buttercream, very small, like little specks, so when you frost your cake, maybe you'll see little white dots in it. The reason for that is that the butter hasn't been completely left to come to room temperature, so the butter's a little bit too cold, and then when you add the sugar to the butter, it forms these little hard granules. It's an absolute pain. There's no way to get rid of them other than removing them one by one, and you'll have hundreds in a batch of buttercream. So it's really, really important to let the butter come to room temperature before you start the process of making the buttercream. The buttercream definitely shouldn't taste grainy. You shouldn't notice any texture. It should be very silky, very smooth. And the reason for that is that the butter and the sugar should completely incorporate to make a smooth buttercream. If you do notice a gritty or a grainy texture, that's from the sugar, not from the butter. And it's either because you haven't sifted the sugar. Sometimes sugar comes pre-sifted, so I actually don't sift the brand that I buy. But if you find that there are clumps in it, you really do need to sift it. The other reason is, unfortunately, just the type of sugar that you're using. It might not be the 10x, the 10 times sifted icing sugar, powdered sugar. So if you try making another batch and you sift the sugar and it still tastes gritty or grainy, It's just the brand of the sugar that you're using. So I've had a lot of people ask me about this, and I've suggested they try a different brand, and they do, and then they have fantastic results. So I know it's not the solution you want to hear, but try a different brand of sugar and hopefully everything will work perfectly. Butter is a yellow product naturally. It does lighten when you mix it, and some brands are lighter than others. But when you finish making the buttercream, if your buttercream still has too much of a yellowish tinge for what you're looking for, it sounds a little bit strange, but use a teeny tiny bit of violet food colour. You can just dip a toothpick into the bottle of colour and then put a really tiny bit to start with, stir it all together, and the violet takes away the yellow tinge and it will make your buttercream look really bright white. If you have air bubbles in your buttercream, it's because you've incorporated too much air into it, which usually happens when you beat the buttercream at too high of a speed. It really needs to be on the lowest speed of your mixer. And if it isn't because of that, then it could be because you were using a whisk instead of a paddle or a beater attachment. If you do have air bubbles in your buttercream, you can try and fix it. Put the buttercream in a big bowl and take a spatula and really slap it around in the bowl. So really aggressively stir it, knock the buttercream against the sides of the bowl, and that will knock the air out of the buttercream. And the more you stir it, the smoother you'll notice it getting. I'd suggest adding the milk or cream to the buttercream at the end of the recipe, just a tablespoon at a time, so you can observe how the consistency of the buttercream is changing as you add the liquid. Because once you make the buttercream too liquid, it's very difficult to get it to go back to the right consistency. You'd have to add even more sugar and then it would become really sweet. There are a few ways to test the consistency that I like to use. The first is just pull your spatula through the bowl of buttercream and observe the trail that the spatula leaves behind. It should be a completely smooth pathway behind the spatula. So both the buttercream trail itself should be smooth, but also the edges of it should be really smooth. When the buttercream is too stiff, you'll notice there are lots of little holes behind the pathway that your spatula's left, and that's where the buttercream's broken away from itself, and it's because it's so stiff that the spatula's tearing it as you pull it. And also the edges of the pathway of the buttercream, you'll see that they're really shaggy, rugged peaks, where the buttercream has, again, almost split apart, and that's because it's really too stiff. So you have to add a lot more milk or cream, but just a tablespoon at a time, so you can see how it does with each tablespoon. The second way I like to test it is to scoop up a little bit of buttercream on my spatula and then just gently tap the spatula on the side of the bowl. Just tap it once or twice and see if the buttercream falls off. This will vary from person to person depending on how firmly they tap the spatula on the bowl, but for me it usually comes off by the second tap, and that shows me that it's the right consistency. If the buttercream is still clinging onto your spatula, it's far too stiff, and if when you lift the spatula up from the bowl the buttercream slides straight off the spatula, then it's definitely too runny. When you frost a cake, it's essential that your buttercream is the right consistency, otherwise you'll have a nightmare crumb coating the cake and a nightmare trying to get the final coat of frosting smooth. So you can test the buttercream when it's in the bowl before you even start frosting your cake, using the methods that I mentioned by dragging your spatula through the bowl and also scooping up some buttercream and tapping it on the side of the bowl and seeing when it falls off. But you can also test it as you're frosting the cake. So the way to do that would be put the buttercream on your offset spatula and start to spread it onto the cake. And if the frosting is clinging onto the offset spatula instead of gliding onto the cake, then you know your buttercream's too stiff and you need to add more liquid. It should spread really easily, like very soft butter spreading onto a piece of bread. And your spatula should glide around the cake, and then you should be able to swipe your offset spatula right off the cake, and it should leave the buttercream behind. It'll leave a little peak as you swipe the spatula off, but the buttercream will stay behind on the cake. It won't pull off with your spatula. It's much more common that buttercream is too stiff rather than too loose or too runny. If it is too loose, when you spread it onto the cake over the top surface of the cake, instead of sticking out over the sides of the cake, it will slide right down the sides of the cake, rather than staying in that smooth top layer at the top. And in that case, I would just recommend turning that into your crumb coat, spread it very thinly all over the cake, let it set, add a bit more sugar to your buttercream and beat it again until it gets thicker, and then use that for your final coat of frosting. I usually use the same consistency of buttercream for frosting a cake or piping. The exception is for Russian tips, where it needs to be maybe a little bit stiffer. So to do that, you can either add a little bit more icing sugar and then stir it together again. Or the other thing you can do is put the frosting in a piping bag, put it in the freezer for 1 minute, set a timer for 1 minute so you don't forget. And then when you take it out of the freezer, do a test flour, and that should be the right consistency. And I have a lot of details on how to pipe with Russian tips in my tutorial on Russian tips, with a few other tips and tricks of how to use those. The only time when I would recommend correcting the consistency of buttercream because it's too loose or too runny by putting it in the fridge is if you're really confident that that problem has been caused by heat. So if you know that the consistency of the buttercream was correct, it had the right balance of sugar and butter and milk or cream, and the consistency was fine, but then maybe you piped with it and you put it in a piping bag and you took a really long time piping your cake and your hands are really warm, or it's a really hot day and you noticed that the buttercream started to get runnier. In that situation, you could put it in the freezer for, if it's in a piping bag, I wouldn't do it for more than 1 minute. If it's in the bowl, you could maybe try 2 minutes, stir it around, and then try and use it again and see if the consistency is better. But if the consistency is too loose because there's too much liquid in the buttercream, because you added too much milk or cream, or maybe you added a liquid flavour ingredient like strawberry puree or lemon curd, and you added too much and the buttercream became too runny, in that situation I wouldn't recommend putting it in the fridge or freezer because the temperature of the buttercream is not going to fix the consistency. Yes, you can. I started baking and decorating cakes in Costa Rica, which has pretty extreme summers, especially at the beach, and I used this buttercream and I never had any problems. There are a few precautions you could take, and there is a substitution you can make. The precautions are, if you're going to serve a cake outside on a hot day, keep the cake in the fridge until you serve it, or until you have to display it outside so that it stays cold for as long as possible. Also keep it in the fridge until you transport it, because a cold cake is going to resist the vibrations and the movements of travel a lot better than a cake at room temperature. Then if you have had the cake in the fridge until you take it outside, even if it sits outside for an hour or two before you eat it, hopefully that will be enough time for it to go from being cold just to room temperature rather than completely melting in the heat. If you put any cake with any frosting in full sunlight on a hot day with no breeze, it's probably not going to last very long, and this buttercream isn't an exception. But you can make the buttercream even more stable than it already is by switching out the butter for shortening, a vegetable shortening, so Crisco, Trex, there are lots of different brands. I can personally taste the flavour, I'll talk about that in a second. So what you could do is you could switch half of the butter out for the vegetable shortening and leave the other half, and that way the buttercream will stand up a little bit better to the heat. I did find in Costa Rica, this was a really strange thing I stumbled across, but if I had to make a cake or cupcakes to sit outside in the heat for a long period of time, and I switched out half of the butter for shortening, if you add a teaspoon of artificial vanilla essence for every batch of buttercream, still keeping the original measurements of the real vanilla extract in the recipe, for some reason the artificial vanilla essence takes away the shortening flavour. It's a very strange thing, I don't know the science behind it, it's just something I found that worked. To make chocolate buttercream, you can either add cocoa powder mixed with a bit of liquid, or you can add melted semi-sweet chocolate, or you can add both. I have my favourite recipe for that on britishgirlbakes.com, and there's a video tutorial as well if you're looking for my recipe. I use gel colours. I don't have just one brand that I use. I've tried Wilton, Americolour and Chefmaster, and I really like all of them. And the advantage of gel colours over liquid colours is that they're really concentrated, so you don't have to use a lot to get really bright colours. Apply them just a few drops at a time because they do work really quickly, but you do have to use quite a lot of them to get very dark colours, like a dark purple or red or black. So just keep adding them bit by bit. And then when you think you've got a colour similar to the shade that you want, maybe a little bit lighter, cover the bowl with cling film saran wrap, a lid, and leave it for 30 minutes, and then check it again, because with time and exposure to air, the colour starts to darken. So your colour will probably get a few shades darker in that time. So if you're trying to get an exact colour match, I would definitely go a little bit lighter than you want the end result to be. My 4-minute buttercream is what's called a crusting buttercream, which means because of the amount of sugar in it, when it's exposed to air, it will eventually crust, which means it just forms a harder surface. I exaggerate this by putting cakes in the fridge so that the buttercream sets really hard, and that lets me do all sorts of decorating techniques, like decorating with acetate transfers, stenciling, carving buttercream, and all of those techniques really rely on having a very firm buttercream. But you can just leave the buttercream at room temperature. It will still form a crust on the outside, but it won't get as hard as it does when it's in the fridge. If you do put your cake in the fridge and it gets that very hard frosting, when you take it out of the fridge and you leave it to come to room temperature before you serve it, the buttercream will soften again. Because of the amount of sugar in the buttercream, you can leave it at room temperature longer than you might leave a cup of milk at room temperature. At room temperature, sealed properly, which means covering it tightly with cling film or saran wrap or a lid, buttercream is fine for 2 to 3 days. It does need to be covered because if it's exposed to the air, it will crust on the outside, and then when you stir the buttercream, you'll get little chunks of crusted buttercream within it. You can put buttercream in the fridge. The same as for room temperature, it's really important to seal it properly. And then you can leave it in the fridge for a week or up to 2 weeks. You can freeze buttercream. I like to do it in a Ziploc bag because it's easier to fit in the freezer than a big Tupperware or bowl, but you can do it however you like as long as it's a sealed container. When you are ready to use it, take it out 2 or 3 hours beforehand so that it has time to thaw and come to room temperature, and then put it in a bowl and stir it, and if it still has lumps of hard buttercream in it, wait for about another hour just to make sure that it's all at room temperature. And then you'll notice that the buttercream looks quite air bubbly, so stir it a few times before you use it to knock those out, and then it will be perfectly smooth and it will behave the same way as if you'd never frozen it or put it in the fridge in the first place. I hope I've answered all of your questions about my 4-minute buttercream. You can find the recipe and video tutorial on how to make it and check the consistency and add other flavours on BritishGirlBakes.com. Thank you so much for watching.